When you're someone with a bit of a public-facing image, you have to be careful what you say on the internet, because on the internet, anything you say can and will be used against you. Which is to say that in a video a couple of weeks ago, I made the mistake of saying the word Delta Time, and now everybody wants a video on Delta Time, and in hindsight, I don't know what I was expecting. Anyway, before we begin, GameMaker's very own community legend John Peterson, the Pixelated Pope, famously has some things to say whenever anyone brings up Delta Time, and because I think it's always a good idea to hear what the experts have to say on these things, let's hear his words of wisdom. So as of my recording this, I haven't actually gotten him to send me his voice lines that he's going to do, and I don't know exactly what he's going to say, but he is the Pixelated Pope, so I'm sure it's going to be lovely. Anyway, joking aside, it would be in our best interest to heed the Pope's words here. Delta time is not something you should do in GameMaker unless you have extreme confidence in your programming abilities, and there's broadly two reasons for this. The first one is that a lot of the built-in systems in GameMaker just inherently do not use Delta time, and if you do anything in GameMaker that makes use of systems that include but are not limited to built-in alarms, built-in object following paths, I would say built-in timelines, but nobody uses timelines, using sequences, using things like the built-in particle systems, those all go out the window when you try to use Delta time. And if you make use of any of those things in your game and you try to add Delta time, you are in for a substantial amount of work rewriting those systems, in some cases fairly fundamental systems, in order to make them play nicely with Delta time. Now, the second reason you don't want to do this, unless you're extremely confident in your programming skills, is because I am probably thinking I'm going to split this up into two videos. In this video, we're going to be, it's going to be fairly straightforward. We're just going to talk about a little bit of arithmetic. The second video is going to involve calculus. So now that I have hopefully adequately explained why Delta time is a bad idea, let's talk about what it actually is. So if I run my sample project here, we are going to have a sort of generic implementation of like a top-down action adventure RPG, whatever genre you want to chunk this into, and it's running at 60 frames per second, as games often do, and it looks fairly reasonable. If I walk around, this is a pretty normal walking speed. Now let's say that if I drop this down to, for example, how about 5 frames per second, we are going to, in addition to, you know, having the game going slow enough that we can see individual frames, we are going to also be moving much slower, because in GameMaker, your step event is tied to your game's refresh rate. For every frame that the game draws, you will also process 1 tick of game input, and if you are drawing fewer frames per second, that means that the game will be processing fewer updates per second, and the whole game is going to slow down. Likewise, if I were to knock this up something a little bit more adventurous, like 480 FPS, we are going to see that the game speeds up for the same reason. We are now processing 8 times as many frames as we were at 60 FPS, and also correspondingly 8 times as many. The game is updating 8 more times per second. And we have here an extremely hyper-caffeinated duck. And the sliding scale also works, you know, obviously, for middle values. 193 is about 3 times our original game speed. I believe in my earlier video on uncapped frame rates, I called this like ludicrous speed or something, and there were a number of people making Spaceballs references in the comments, and I have never been more proud of you nerds. Alright, so how are we going to do this? So, I think I'm going to not talk about calculus yet in this video. The most common implementation of Delta time that you are likely to see in a GameMaker game is, let's go into the player step event, and here we can see that we are, I think that's still a little small, we can see that we are doing the usual GameMaker movement code thing. So if keyboard check left or keyboard check A, your horizontal speed is going to be some negative value. You can do the same thing with the other arrow keys or WASD. Then you can ignore this block of code, because this basically just makes sure that our sprite's facing direction is set up correctly. But we are going to just say x plus equals dx, y plus equals dy. If I didn't scare you away on purpose at the beginning of the video, I'm sure that you all know what this is about. So if we want frame rate independence, we could, instead of saying this is how far we're going to move per step, we could instead say, well, there's actually two ways of thinking about this, and they're mathematically equivalent, but the one that I think I prefer, and probably most people prefer, is to say, let's say that instead of moving 2 units per step, we're going to move 120 units per second, which at 60 frames per second is going to be 2 units per step. And if we use this as our unit of motion, we are going to need a way to convert between units per second and units per step. So GameMaker, speaking of delta time, does come packaged with a variable called delta time. What this is the amount of time that has elapsed since the last frame was processed in microseconds. I wish that it was just in either milliseconds or regular seconds, but this is the amount of time that has passed since the last frame in microseconds. Just to make everything so much easier, we're going to need this value in seconds. So I'm going to divide this by 1 million, because after all, 1 microsecond is 1/1,000,000th of a second. If you divide some number in microseconds by 1 million, you get that value in seconds. And I'm just going to save this to a variable called dt. And this is now going to represent the amount of time in seconds that has elapsed since the previous frame, the previous step event was run. And if we want to convert movement speed in units per second to movement speed in units per step, we can simply multiply move speed by that dt timescale value. You can, of course, assign this to some other variable. We can call it like var instantaneous move speed or something like that, and we can say that that equals move speed times dt. You could also just say like move speed times equals dt, something like that. Again, and now when I run the game, if I walk around at our standard 60 FPS, we're still moving at the same speed. If I drop this down, say 6 FPS, we're still moving at the same speed, even though we're moving slowly enough, even though the game is updating slowly enough that we can, again, any individual frame is going to like persist in our vision. If I increase this to, say, 300 FPS, we're still moving at about the same speed, although we are noticing some we're noticing some other funny artifacts, such as our animation speed is going absolutely insane, and also the NPCs are still zipping around at the speed of sound because I haven't given them the same treatment. Now, I said there were multiple ways to arrive at this value, and the other way that you can do this, if you really do want to define your movement values in like units per step instead of units per second for whatever reason, if you were to assume that your like base movement speed is going to be 60 FPS, it is also possible that you could, instead of declaring that delta time is going to be the amount of time that has elapsed since the previous frame in seconds, we could also declare that delta time is going to be the basically the difference in our actual current frame rate and what our target frame rate is. So we could use this as a multiplier where, for example, if your game is running at 60 FPS, dt equals 1. If your game is running at 120 FPS, dt equals 0.5. If your game is running at 6 FPS, dt would be 10, because everything is moving at a tenth the speed. And the way that we might arrive at that value would be to say something like delta time divided by 1 million multiplied by our target frame rate. And our target frame rate, as I have rather arbitrarily decided, is going to be 60, which is going to be sort of our standard of comparison for all of our calculations that we do this way. This is not like our current like frame rate that the game is trying to hit. For example, game speed FPS, as you might be familiar. We actually want this to be 60. Because in this instance, we have decided that like 60 is our like default speed, and if the game is running faster or slower than that, then we're going to want to scale it up or down to meet it. And if I do this now, we are still at 60 FPS, moving around at a fairly normal speed. If I were to slow this down, the distance that we travel per second is still more or less the same as it was. If I were to speed this up, the distance that we travel per second is still more or less the same that it was. So if you ask me, in most cases, I would prefer to do the former here. I would prefer to set our movement speed in terms of units per second instead of units per step. And that's just because, like, I know how far it is if you're going to move 120 units per second, and I know how long a second is. In case anyone's wondering, at like 32 square pixel tiles, that's a little bit less than 4 tiles per second. I have no concept of what 2 units per step even means, other than that, like, you know, that it more or less seems to feel good. I think this is definitely the most common way of representing delta time, but I just mentioned the other method just in case, like, you ever happen to stumble across somebody else's code and you see a delta time value that's like 1.00005 or something instead of like 16.66666 or anything like that. Okay, one more thing on this. Right after I finished recording this, I remember that there is actually another reason why you probably don't want to do delta time like this in GameMaker, and that is because the FPS value that GameMaker gives you, and not FPS real, that we don't talk about that, but the actual FPS value that GameMaker gives you only updates every 2 seconds, and that means that if you get a brief lag spike, or if you get a brief period where your FPS goes up, calculating delta time like this will not be able to account for that and smooth it out. You can do a bunch of math to track the frame times of your game separately, but the more manual work you have to do, the less appealing this option gets, so I'm gonna say just define everything per second. It makes life easier. So now that we've gotten the easy part out of the way, let's have a look at some places where this is sort of not working. So there's a couple places in this code where this could be a problem. So I mentioned image index and image speed and whatnot. I'm actually in this sample project not using image speed, which I forgot about until about 30 seconds ago. So GameMaker's built-in image speed is a fixed value that will that the game engine will append to image index for like sprite image frame controls by default. And a lot of people do use image speed and image index. In this case, I didn't, for whatever reason, because I set this up weirdly. So the more I looked into how GameMaker's image index and image speed behave internally, like, the weirder it gets, and I feel like I need to dedicate a separate aside to this now. So, GameMaker somehow, and I can't believe this is something I'm actually having to say, but GameMaker simultaneously made image index and image speed easier and also more complicated at the exact same time. So I don't remember exactly when this change was made. I think it was part of the 2.3 update a couple of years ago, but you can define in your GameMaker sprite properties your sprite speed in terms of either frames per second or frames per game frame. If you set this to frames per game frame, then your image speed is going to be what I described it as doing earlier, and it's just going to be it's just going to be a value that's added onto your image index at the end of every frame. But if you set it to, instead, frames per game frame, your image speed will actually be delta time so that it works at a certain number of... rather, if you set it to frames per second, image speed will be delta timed internally so that it works no matter what your game's frame rate is. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say in most cases that is what's going to make your life easier. But it also does create a really bizarre situation where image speed can now do one of two very different things depending on what your sprite setting is set to. And for what it's worth, I kind of suspect that this is a moot point for most people who are going to be far along enough in their game dev journey where they're actually trying to worry about delta time, because I'm going to guess that a lot of you have already hacked together a strategy for dealing with image, like, sprite animation frames that doesn't involve this. Sort of like what I had before, but hopefully better, because that was... I really don't know why I tried to go and just jam all the 4 directions together in a single sprite. Like, that didn't seem to really make my life that much easier, and it's not something I usually do. But anyway, GameMaker, why are you like this? In any case, because I set this sample project up weird, this value here, this 0.125, is basically our image speed. This is, again, in terms of, like, image frames per game frame, image frames per step. If I wanted to define that in terms of a unit per second, we could say var target image speed equals 0.125 times 60, and that is going to be that many frames per second of animation. And we could then, of course, multiply that by dt. And you can see how this would cancel out, right? So 60 times 1/60th is just going to be where you started. 60 times some other delta time value is going to be, you know, some other delta time value. Let's just toss that in there because it makes us feel good. Now, if I run the game, we are going to have the duck walking around and animating at more or less normal speed when the game is set to 60 FPS. If I were to drop this down to like 30, we're still moving around and animating at approximately the same speed, notwithstanding the fact that 36.418 FPS doesn't evenly divide into my my 60 hertz refresh rate in my monitor. And if I were to increase the target FPS further, everything else is going haywire. The game is attempting to do about 400 FPS, but our movement and animation speed is still working as it did before. So you can probably, depending on how you have your GameMaker image speeds and image frames controls set up, this may or may not be that painful. Let's start looking in other places. So the fact that all the other NPCs are kind of walking around on their own, that's kind of a problem in and of itself, and that especially if you're trying to add this into a game which has been originally designed to work at a fixed time step. Any object that's moving in your game, if you want to convert the whole thing to use delta time, you're going to have to go into its code where it moves around, and you're going to have to edit it. For example, in NPCs, which are a different object than our player, we have a simplified movement controls. So we're going to give this the same treatment. We're going to say move speed equals 120. Move, actually first var dt equals dt equals delta time divided by 1,000,000. I feel like every time I do this, there's one or two people who are like, I had no idea you could use underscores as spaces or numbers. And that's definitely, it's not one of the like headlining banner features of GameMaker nor any other language that supports this, but it's very nice whenever you want to write out a number like 1,000,000 and you want to be able to like visually see how many zeros you've written out, and I definitely recommend doing that. Anyway, move speed times equals dt, and then down here at the bottom, x plus equals our x and y step multiplied by our move speed. And of course, might as well do the same thing for animation. What did I call it earlier? Target image speed? I can't just call it image speed because that would be a naming collision with a GameMaker built in. Let's call it like animation speed because I don't feel like typing out that whole name every time. And that's also going to be 7.5. We can multiply that by our delta time as well. We can just go and toss that in here. And now our dog NPCs are more or less going to be animating at the same speed whenever they walk. I still have this set to 60 FPS. All right, let's increase that. So you, at least are moving at the original speed. You almost can't see the fact that they're also animating at the original speed too, because the motion is so short. And the reason that that is the case is because alarms in GameMaker do not work well with delta time at all. And this is one of the places where you kind of have to throw out the whole entire built-in GameMaker system if you want to use delta time. So there is no nice, convenient, easy way to make alarms work with delta time. You can like manually add or remove some fudge factor from the actual value of the alarm system in GameMaker. Don't do that. At that point, it is significantly more work than just writing your own timing systems. And that's sort of the case with a lot of the places, the built-in GameMaker systems, where things fall apart when you try to use delta time, whether that be like following paths or following sequences or anything like that. You can introduce fudge factors in like the various timing speeds and the various like path following speeds or whatever, but it's just at that point just why. I am going to rewrite my alarms to work with delta time, and then I'm going to stop because this has been going on for long enough. I think we've made our point and what kind of difficulty this presents. So firstly, I've never really talked about how the alarms in these NPC objects work before. So there's a primary alarm, which is basically the amount of time between random steps when the NPCs walk in a random direction. which is set to some number between 2 seconds and like 5 seconds. And there's a secondary alarm, which I had open just now, which is basically how long until you stop walking once you start walking. And, man, how do I even want to go about doing this? So there's kind of two ways that you could go about replacing GameMaker's built-in alarm system. Whether that's because you need to make something that works with Delta Time or just because you want to. The way that I usually do it, honestly, mostly out of laziness, because the other way involves a lot more typing and, well, I'm a lazy sack of potatoes, is to sort of verbatim re-implement the GameMaker alarm system, but instead of having them tick down by one value per frame, you would have them tick down by the delta time step. And to do this, we could say something like alarm, let's call it alarm 0 equals random range between 2 and like 5 or whatever it was. And remember, our time is now going to be in seconds instead of frames, and what I had there previously was the equivalent of like between 2 and 5-ish frames. And if I were to go and grab my alarm 0 code, we could go into the regular step event. I'm going to move out this delta time step into the beginning of the step event so that it exists outside the scope of this if statement here. We could say if alarm 0 is it's greater than 0, then we can say alarm 0 minus equals our delta time step, and if alarm 0 is now less than or equal to 0, because alarms only fire once when they tick down below 0, they don't continuously fire. We are going to, in this case, set my moving variable to true. We're going to set my moving direction to some random direction, up, down, left, or right. And also, I am going to want to set alarm 1. So if I go and re-implement alarm 1, alarm 1 equals, I'm just going to initialize that to -1, because it starts out unset. We can go and grab our alarm 1 code. I guess I can just delete both of these now, because I don't really need them. We can give this the same treatment. Let's fix the indentation. Let us call this alarm 1 instead of alarm 0. And now I can say, instead of resetting alarm index 1, we can just set alarm _1. And this is going to be some value between 1/3 of a second and 2/3 of a second. And the last thing we need to do is, when alarm 1 goes off, reset alarm _0 to some random number between 2 and 5. There's like a certain type of computer science purist who would be very, very unhappy with me for giving you all permission to write code like this, but, well, if you are that sort of person, you probably already know how time sources work, and you are perfectly happy using those. And to everyone else, sometimes you don't need an over-engineered solution. Anyway, if I were to do this, we would have, for the most part, let me just increase that a little bit. For the most part, we still have NPCs walking around at the same speed, rate, and animation speed that they were before. Speed, frequency, and animation speed that they were before. This is going to be true no matter what our target frame rate is. If I were to go drop that down further, this feels really weird, but if I were to wait for one of you to move, you basically teleported into position because you, like, 5 FPS is like 200 milliseconds, and that was enough time for you to, like, decide to stop moving. Like, not completely, but you're only moving for like 2 frames. Anyway, that is an instance of delta time in a basic game. And again, I must reiterate, if you are going to use delta time in anything, you must do something like this in every object in your game that moves, every object that features any kind of timing mechanism. If you use paths, you're going to have to implement something like this for manually following paths. If you use GameMaker's built-in particle system, which many, many people do, good luck. So one last thing before I go, and I deliberately left this to the end so that I can see who watches the video before leaving a comment. Other game engines do have other ways of implementing delta time / frame rate independence. Unity, for example, is a game engine which will actually decouple your game update, your gameplay logic from your rendering. Unity's physics system will update at 50 FPS, and the game render loop will update at 60. That is an interesting trade-off, to be sure. I can't say I'm the biggest fan of it. I think it introduces some weirdness in other ways that are substantially more annoying to deal with than what we have in GameMaker, but that's neither here nor there. There have been attempts to do something like that in GameMaker by various people over the years. Juju Adams, because there's nothing that he hasn't done at this point, has a little project called Iota, which will try to interpolate values using a time step like this in its own way. I might make a video on Iota someday, and I need to be careful how I say this because I don't want to make it sound like I'm dunking on Juju or anything. I don't like Iota. I don't like working in that way. I don't like setting up my code that way. I don't like structuring my project that way. I think it is a solution which would be substantially more simple if you just sat down and did the calculus instead of trying to find ways around that. And that's what we're going to be talking about next time. So, come back then if you want to see some places where just multiplying by a time step value like this will not work, sometimes in rather spectacular ways. I'm going to end this off here. My name is Michael. I like wizards and dragons and making games. If you want the code for this, look for the GitHub repository down in the description of the video. I do like to make videos on weird stuff you can do in GameMaker, so if any of this appeals to you, feel free to subscribe. I have a Patreon, so if you want to contribute to the channel, links to that can be found in all the usual places. You should all go check out Wizarducks and the Lost Hat, which is one of the games that I like to work on when I'm not doing YouTube stuff. Link to the Steam page can be found down below. I hope you all enjoyed that, for some definition of enjoyed, and I will see you all later.
I'd like scream into a pillow or something, but my girlfriend's still asleep, and she'd probably not appreciate that.
Special thanks to Zenjamin, Squarecrow, Spy Die Games, Manta Ray, GameMaker, GameArt Indie, Edward Holt, DJ Gibbles, and Bokeh Dev for supporting these videos. If you want to contribute to the channel, head on over to the Patreon page down in the video description to join the fun.